I'd like to begin by thanking Akapuma and Nemekene of Tawantinsuya Nation for organizing this event. I know how much work it takes to coordinate all the logistics involved in bringing people together, and really appreciate this important platform. So thank you. I'm here because Trenton Oldfield and I initiated the Legal Defense Fund for Isabella Acevedo, and I'd like to thank Akapuma and Nemekene also for their immediate and unquestioned support for Isabella and the fund, and for their always prompt advice and insight for us. Thank you also to everyone who's come here today to join in this discussion. I will do my best. I will do my best to talk about the question of how did Isabella Acevedo come to clean MP Mark Harper's home, providing both personal and historical context. I hope to show how there's been a deliberate agenda established centuries ago to create a system of servitude, of vulnerable, landless people whose bodies and lives are able to be exploited. This includes a whole range from working for low or no pay, room and board, to being agents for the very people who oppress them, either through army, police force, or even working in government. I would classify all of these together because they all mean sacrificing oneself in order to further the very system that is causing one's hardship and landless status. So I'll begin by sharing more about the Legal Defense Fund for Isabella. Then I'll go on to talk about MP Mark Harper and the policies he was responsible for, connecting this to the longer history of colonialism and servitude, and lastly outlining the situation of Isabella now and what we can do collectively to support her and the many others who are in her situation. So, on Saturday, the 8th of February, a story broke in the media that Mark Harper, the Conservative Minister of State for Immigration, was resigning. Apparently, he had just found out that the person who had cleaned his home and ironed his clothes for over 7 years was an undocumented worker. Britain has never been welcoming to immigrants, or as they call us, foreigners, but under Mark Harper's leadership, some of the most abhorrent and vicious immigration policies have been enacted. This includes ramping up the role and presence of the UK Border Agency, stationing uniformed and armed agents at tube stations in predominantly migrant neighbourhoods, demanding that people show their documents and residency or work permits, despite the fact that this is illegal. No one is obliged to show this information, to give their names or personal details to anyone. Putting through legislation that would require landlords to see one's work visa or immigration status before letting their properties. Landlords who do not comply would then be fined or imprisoned. In this way, the landlord becomes a border agent, and it is more and more difficult for those without documents to secure basic shelter. Under Mark Harper, people from India and Nigeria, for example, who come to study in the UK universities are required to give the UK government £2,000 bond, which they then get back when they leave the country, reinforcing this idea that we are all potential illegal migrants wishing to sneak into Britain. Harper was responsible for the racist Go Home van campaign, in which vans were driven around specific neighbourhoods in London with enormous posters that threatened, quote, "In the UK illegally, go home or face arrest." This is a way to create a climate of fear and anxiety in which the brown or black body is constantly under suspicion, constantly under attack, constantly made to feel unwelcome and vulnerable. There are two basic assumptions underlining all of Mark Harper's policies. One, we are here to exploit and use the benefit system. And two, we are here to take away white British jobs. Of course, these two ideas contradict one another, But logic isn't necessary when one is tapping into long-held prejudice and hatred. So we're told, because of the great number of migrants, the school system is failing, the NHS is under a lot of pressure, there are long waits for social housing, etc., etc. In short, the white British people's standard of living is suffering by our very presence. Of course, we all know this is complete and utter false rhetoric. This country depends on the labor of migrants, documented and undocumented. Countless reports show how migrants contribute far more in taxes than they receive in benefits. Migrants also start up their own businesses, so they are not taking a job away from the great British public. And far more white British people leave this country every year as migrants than those who arrive. White people are the biggest migrants in the world, occupying Australia, Canada, USA, South and Central America, so on. Furthermore, it's important to note that the wealth in this nation, which is enormous, Britain is one of the richest countries in the world, is based on illegally occupying and exploiting lands and people across the globe for hundreds of years. So vast was their theft of our lands that at the peak of their power in the 18th and 19th century, they would very proudly proclaim, "The sun never sets on the British Empire," because at least one part of the lands they claimed would be in sunlight at any given time. This phrase was actually first used to describe the Spanish Empire of the 16th and 17th century. This country and this continent could not function without us. Case in point, Isabella Acevedo. For over 7 years, Mark Harper was able to exploit her labor. He paid her £30 a week for 4 hours of work, 4 hours of work in which she would clean his home and iron his clothes. He was then compensated £22 by the government, our taxpayers' money, for the much maligned expenses. So whilst he was very publicly enacting this hardline, tough-on-immigrant policies, he was privately very happy to benefit from the cheap labor of a migrant worker. He resigned and was hailed as being dignified and praised for doing the right thing. Isabella was referred to as an illegal. In one moment, Isabella lost her entire income. She also worked for a number of other politicians, so there's a bigger story to come up from this. When Harper found out she was undocumented, just before he resigned, he ordered a raid of her home. Isabella thankfully wasn't home, but was then forced into hiding. When Trenton read the news, he said, "We must start a legal defense fund for Isabella Acevedo." Our family had just finished its own struggle with the Home Office, who was seeking to deport Trenton after a peaceful protest against a culture of elitism and superiority, the very culture that creates these inhumane and vicious policies.